So imagine you just found an $11 billion windfall in your budget.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, right. Just completely unexpected cash. But you also happen to be sitting on a massive mountain of high-interest debt.
Right, of course.
So what do? Do you take that windfall and, pay down what you owe? Or do you double down, max out the credit card even further, and use that borrowed money to launch basically a state-funded venture capital firm?
Well, the Canadian government just chose the latter.
They really did. Welcome to today's Deep Dive. I'm so glad you're joining us for this one. Our mission today is to unpack Canada's 2026 Spring Economic Update.
Yeah, the official title they're going with is Canada Strong for All.
Right. Tabled by Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne under Prime Minister Mark Carney.
And we have a pretty formidable stack of sources to synthesize for you today.
We really do. We're pulling directly from the government's own financial documents, obviously.
Yeah.
Plus some really great on-the-ground reporting from Global News, CTV, CP24, and VOCM. And we're also layering in some heavy-hitting economic analysis from RBC, CPA Canada, and the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. So we're looking at where this money's actually going.
The mechanisms behind the policy.
Exactly. And why critics across the entire political spectrum are just, sounding the alarm.
Because it is a massive macroeconomic gamble. I mean, the strategy we're analyzing today is basically an attempt to use public money to absorb the early risks of these colossal corporate projects.
Right.
All with the hope of crowding in private capital on a scale the country really hasn't seen in recent history.
Which is wild. But to understand the spending, we first have to understand that windfall I mentioned.
Right. The headline numbers for this update reveal a pretty significant shift. So the projected federal deficit for the 2025-2026 fiscal year was originally pegged at $78.3 billion.
Okay.
But it actually came in lower at $66.9 billion.
Which gives the government an $11.4 billion improvement.
Exactly.
And that cash didn't just, materialize out of thin air.
Yeah.
Our sources point to a highly resilient labor market, which is keeping income tax revenues strong, and also a major spike in global oil prices. West Texas Intermediate crude has been averaging, between $73 and $80 a barrel.
Yeah, right in that pocket. And since Canada sits on the world's third largest oil reserves, when global energy prices surge like that,
the federal treasury captures a massive financial upside.
Exactly. But the core issue here, the thing everyone is talking about, is what the government chose to do with that upside.
Right.
Because they did not bank the windfall to pay down the national debt. They actually spent roughly 80% of it.
Wow, 80%.
Yeah. So the result is $37.5 billion in net new spending spread over the next 6 years.
Which means long-term deficits are going to remain deeply elevated.
Oh, absolutely. They're projected to hover right around $53.2 billion by 2030, 2031.
And the most striking figure in these documents, I think, is the debt servicing charge. Just paying the interest on the national debt, just the interest, is going to climb to a staggering $81 billion by 2030.
It's a huge number.
Let's pause on that $81 billion, because that is an astonishing amount of money to spend just to carry your debt.
It really is.
I mean, think about it. That's capital stripped away from healthcare, from infrastructure, or, potential tax relief for you, the listener. It's like getting a surprise year-end bonus at work, and instead of paying off your credit card, you use it as a down payment on a boat.
A very expensive boat.
Right. It brings up this glaring contradiction, because the government's messaging repeatedly describes the Canadian economy as resilient.
They love that word.
So if the economy is supposedly operating from this position of strength, why are they spending tens of billions of dollars in new money just to stimulate it?
Well, the answer there lies in the divergence between nominal GDP and real GDP.
Okay, break that down for us.
Sure. So nominal GDP is the raw, unadjusted number. When global oil prices are hovering around $80 a barrel, Canada's nominal GDP looks spectacular on paper.
Right, because the raw cash flowing into the economy is high.
Exactly. But when economists strip away inflation and look at real GDP, which is the actual volume of goods and services the country is producing, like the true measure of productivity, the picture is incredibly weak.
How weak are we talking?
Real growth is barely hovering around 1%.
Oh, wow. So high oil prices are essentially masking a severe productivity problem.
Completely masking it. The Treasury looks rich, but the actual engine of the economy is stalling out, especially compared to our G7 peers.
So that's the structural reality the government is facing here.
Yeah, and they're using this unexpected cash windfall plus billions in new borrowed money to try and jolt that sluggish real economy awake.
They're trying to pivot this enormous, slow-moving fiscal ship to a really aggressive growth agenda.
And that's the plan.
So let's look at how they actually plan to buy that growth. They're taking two massive interconnected swings. The first is the Canada Strong Fund.
Right.
The government is launching Canada's first sovereign wealth fund, and they're seeding it with $25 billion in federal money.
And the mandate for that fund is to take direct equity stakes in major domestic infrastructure and tech projects, so they want everyday Canadians to be able to invest directly down the line.
And the second swing is the human capital side of the equation. It's called Team Canada Strong.
Yeah, this is a $5.96 billion investment over 5 years, and the target here is to recruit and train between 80,000 and 100,000 new Red Seal skilled trades workers by 2031.
Okay, I want to challenge the mechanics of that sovereign wealth fund for a second.
Go for it.
Because here's where it gets really interesting. I was reading the analysis from University of Virginia economist Jason Childs.
Oh, yeah, he had some strong points.
You really did. He brings up this structural flaw. Traditional sovereign wealth funds, like the really famous one in Norway.
Right, the oil fund.
Exactly. They're funded by budget surpluses.
Yeah.
Norway takes the actual profit from their oil exports
Mhm.
and banks it to build generational wealth.
Makes sense.
But the Canadian government openly admits this $25 billion in seed money is entirely borrowed. We are currently running a $66.9 billion deficit.
Yeah.
So how can a sovereign wealth fund even operate if the sovereign doesn't actually possess any wealth to start it?
Well, that's the thing. It fundamentally changes the risk profile. The government is essentially acting like a venture capital firm, but, they're playing with the taxpayer's credit card.
Right.
Historically, when the government wanted to stimulate a major pipeline or critical minerals mine, they offered subsidies or grants or debt guarantees.
And the company took the money, built the project, and kept the profits.
Exactly. The taxpayer just absorbed the cost of the subsidy. But under this new fund, the government wants a seat on the board. They want a slice of the equity.
They want a financial return on the upside.
They do. But the strategy goes beyond just taking a cut of the profits. The government's real calculation here is that their $25 billion in public equity will act as a de-risking mechanism.
Meaning what, exactly?
They're hoping that by putting taxpayer money on the line first, they'll attract or crowd in, as they call it, up to $500 billion in private capital.
$500 billion.
Yeah. The idea is that institutional investors might feel much safer jumping into a massive, complex infrastructure project if they know the federal government has skin in the game.
But wait, if a proposed mega project is genuinely a good, profitable idea, shouldn't the private sector want to fund it themselves?
You would think so.
Right. Doesn't the fact that corporate investors need the government to absorb the early stage risk signal that these might be fundamentally bad or at least highly precarious investments to begin with?
And that right there is the multi-billion-dollar question at the heart of this budget. Because borrowing to invest is a real high-wire act. If those projects underperform the interest rate the government is paying on that borrowed $25 billion,
then the taxpayer is on the hook for both the investment losses and the debt servicing.
Exactly. It's a double hit. But the government believes the bottleneck preventing private investment isn't a lack of profitable ideas. They think it's a lack of execution capacity.
Okay, execution capacity.
You're right, because you simply cannot build a $500 billion worth of new infrastructure if you don't have the labor force to pour the concrete or string the transmission lines or weld the pipes.
Which perfectly explains the timing of that $6 billion Team Canada Strong trades program.
Exactly. Seeding a sovereign wealth fund is entirely useless if there is no physical workforce to execute the blueprints.
So the government has realized they must build an army of 100,000 tradespeople almost from scratch.
Yeah, and to do that, they are heavily subsidizing the training pipeline. They're offering up to $10,000 in wage subsidies for small and medium enterprises that hire apprentices.
Because small businesses typically take a massive productivity hit when they have to train someone green.
Right. And they're also giving apprentices a $400 weekly grant during their technical training, plus a $5,000 bonus upon actually completing their Red Seal certification.
Okay, so the macro strategy is pretty clear. Borrow billions to fund the projects and borrow billions more to build the workforce.
That's the bet.
But we need to look at what this update actually means for your wallet. Because while the government is placing these massive debt-fueled corporate bets, the policies aimed at easing the daily cost of living crisis for you are structurally very different.
The contrast is honestly stark. The direct financial impacts aimed at everyday affordability, they're highly targeted micro adjustments.
Let's give some examples.
Right, take the Canada Pension Plan, the CPP. The government is dropping the contribution rate from 9.9% down to 9.5% starting in 2027.
Okay, let's run the math on that. For someone earning $70,000 a year, dropping the CPP rate by that margin translates to about $133 of savings.
Annually.
Annually, yeah.
Yeah.
And look, while nobody is going to reject an extra 133 bucks, we have to look at the scale of the cost of living crisis. Saving $11 a month does not move the needle on grocery inflation or utility bills.
It really doesn't. And we see a similar micro approach in their housing policy. So the government is adjusting the home buyers plan, the HBP.
Right.
Currently, if you withdraw money from your RRSP to buy a first home, you get a 2-year grace period before you have to start repaying those funds.
Okay.
They're extending that grace period to 5 years for any withdrawals made through 2028.
The mechanism there is interesting. It frees up about $4,000 a year in cash flow during those 3 extra years, right? Because you aren't making repayments.
Exactly.
It's basically hitting the snooze button on your mortgage repayment alarm. But by giving first-time buyers more upfront cash flow, the government is arguably just pouring more demand into a housing market that already severely lacks supply.
Right. You aren't making houses cheaper. You're just allowing buyers to carry more debt for a slightly longer period.
Exactly. What else is in the daily life category?
There's a significant administrative shift regarding air travel.
Oh, this is a big one.
Yeah, so the Canadian Transportation Agency has this paralyzing backlog of 96,000 air passenger complaints.
96,000.
It's huge. So the government is moving responsibility for that directly to the Minister of Transport. They plan to hire a third-party dispute resolution organization modeled on systems they use in the UK and the EU to finally clear out that backlog and force airline compliance.
There are also some really highly specific tax and tech policies in the documents. Like, they're streamlining the disability tax credit to reduce the massive paperwork burden.
Which is much needed.
Yeah, they're expanding the list of medical practitioners who can certify eligibility to include physiotherapists and podiatrists. They're also making the $10 million capital gains exemption permanent for employee ownership trusts.
Which is a mechanism to help retiring business owners sell their companies directly to their employees rather than to, like, private equity firms.
Right. And for seasonal workers in 13 specific economic regions, they're extending up to 5 additional weeks of employment insurance benefits until October 2028.
And then on the technology side, they introduced 6 pillars for a new national AI strategy.
Led by Minister Evan Solomon, right?
Yes. And the centerpiece of that strategy is a major push for sovereign compute.
Sovereign compute is such a fascinating geopolitical necessity. For anyone unfamiliar, it means building and maintaining the massive data centers required for AI directly on Canadian soil.
And operating under Canadian privacy laws.
Exactly. Because if your entire digital economy relies on AI infrastructure located in another country, you are entirely vulnerable to their regulatory whims or trade disputes.
Absolutely. And this digital push also includes new regulations specifically targeting crypto ATMs and stablecoins.
As part of an anti-money laundering initiative.
Right. Legacy financial tracking systems just simply cannot keep up with the volume of decentralized digital currency flowing across borders right now. They're trying to close those loopholes.
So when you lay all these pocketbook measures out on the table, a very clear pattern emerges. The government is tinkering around the edges with administrative tweaks and targeted tax credits.
Well, they're forced to tinker. Because the macro budget is so deeply committed to capitalizing the sovereign wealth fund and servicing that $81 billion in interest payments, the fiscal flexibility simply does not exist for broad, sweeping consumer tax cuts.
The Treasury is essentially tapped out.
It's totally tapped out.
So this blend of micro-affordability tweaks and massive debt-fueled corporate gambles has resulted in some fierce pushback.
Oh, definitely.
Let's explore the political and economic reactions. But first, it is crucial to establish the political reality here. Prime Minister Mark Carney recently secured a parliamentary majority through by-elections and floor crossings.
Right.
Meaning, this economic update will pass. The government does not need to negotiate or water down their agenda to appease the opposition. They own this strategy entirely.
They really do. And the pushback we're seeing across our sources perfectly illustrates the competing economic philosophies at play.
And just a quick note for you listening. We're exploring the viewpoints from our sources here to give you the full picture. We aren't taking sides or endorsing these views, just impartially laying out how the different political camps are reacting to the source material.
Exactly. So, starting on the political right, conservative leader Pierre Poilievre characterizes the update as credit card budgeting.
Credit card budgeting.
Yeah. The conservative argument is that Prime Minister Carney has essentially doubled the structural deficits left behind by the previous administration. They argue that the sovereign wealth fund just enriches corporate insiders while placing the entire financial burden on future generations.
Right. And then on the political left, you have NDP leader Avi Lewis. He frames the update as a massive missed opportunity for working-class Canadians.
His critique really focuses on the total lack of new healthcare spending.
Yeah, he points out that the micro adjustments, like that $133 CPP savings, are entirely insufficient to combat the structural affordability crisis everyday people are facing.
And then there's the Bloc Québécois leader, Yves-François Blanchet. He basically dismissed the update's headline numbers as an illusion.
You called it a show, right?
Yes. He highlighted that the only reason the deficit shrank from $78 billion to $66 billion was due to the artificial inflation of global oil prices, combined with money the government had previously allocated but failed to actually deploy.
So that's the political side. But economists are bringing their own structural critiques to the table, too.
Yeah, like Kevin Page from the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. He highlighted a massive transparency gap.
Specifically regarding national defense.
Exactly. Canada has formally committed to reaching NATO's defense spending target of 2% of GDP. Yet this economic update provides absolutely no financial roadmap for how the country will pay for that required military buildup.
Which is huge. It's a massive unfunded liability just sitting right outside the frame of this budget.
It really is.
Now, I want to ask you about something our media sources kept repeating, because it's a fascinating contradiction. Multiple outlets noted that the document gives off distinct Harper-era vibes, referencing former conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper.
Right.
But in the exact same breath, they labeled it Trudeau-era spending. How can a single economic update embody two entirely opposed political philosophies?
It's such a good question. You really have to look at the separation between the tone and the mechanism.
Okay, unpack that.
So the tone of the update feels like the Harper era. The rhetoric is heavily focused on expanding global trade, building hard physical infrastructure like pipelines and mines, and leaning into targeted micro-tax reliefs rather than launching sweeping new social programs.
And the branding around Team Canada Strong and the focus on skilled blue-collar trades is deeply business-centric.
Exactly. But the underlying machinery powering those policies is entirely different.
The mechanism.
Right. The mechanism relies on a willingness to run massive systemic deficits year after year to fund direct, top-down government intervention in the private sector.
Whereas a traditional Harper-era budget would have prioritized balancing the books and cutting state spending.
Exactly. So the Carney approach is using the language of industry and investment, but funding it with a very debt-heavy playbook.
It's fascinating. We have covered incredible ground today. The 2026 Spring Economic Update is, at its core, a high-stakes bet on the future.
It really is.
The government found an $11 billion windfall hidden in high oil prices, and rather than paying off the national credit card, they leveraged it. They are betting that injecting $25 billion of borrowed seed money into a sovereign wealth fund, alongside $6 billion to build a massive new army of skilled trades workers, will trigger a long-term economic renaissance.
And force the private sector off the sidelines. They're essentially attempting to buy their way out of a slow-growth, low-productivity cycle. But by taking direct equity stakes in these mega projects using borrowed money, they're exposing you, the taxpayer, to unprecedented financial risk if these corporate investments fail to turn a profit.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to ponder. The government is spending roughly $6 billion to recruit and train up to 100,000 new plumbers, electricians, pipe fitters, and welders. And they are promising these apprentices an infrastructure boom. But what happens if those workers complete their training, secure the red seals, and enter the job market in 2030, only to find that the private capital never actually showed up?
What happens if the heavily subsidized, get-funded mega projects they were promised never break ground?
Exactly. Are we building a highly skilled workforce for a guaranteed future, or are we building an army of labor for a massive financial phantom that might never actually materialize?
It is the ultimate test of state intervention, because you can subsidize the training, but you cannot force the market to build.
You really can't. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. Remember to look past the headline numbers, examine the mechanisms behind the policies, and always search for the bigger picture. We'll catch you next time.